The night Walter Booker's car died was the quietest night the house had ever known. The familiar hum of the old Toyota, the gentle purr that carried his children to sleep after his late-night Uber runs, was gone. It had sputtered once, twice, then coughed its last breath in the middle of Sycamore Street, a tired old soldier giving up after years of service. Walter sat behind the wheel long after the engine went still, his broad hands gripping the steering wheel as if sheer will could bring it back to life. Outside, streetlights flickered against the hood's dull paint, reflecting the weary face of a man who had given everything he had and still felt it wasn't enough. He walked home that night instead of calling for help. The distance wasn't far, but every step carried the weight of fear he refused to show his children. At 52, Walter's knees ached, and his back screamed with every stride, but his mind was louder. How would he keep the lights on? The rent paid? The pantry full? He had always found a way before, but this time, the road ahead looked darker than ever. At the small blue house on the corner, the porch light flickered, a bulb he had been meaning to replace. Inside, laughter had faded into yawns. The children, his patchwork family of love and chance, had fallen asleep on the worn couch and makeshift mattresses that lined the living room floor. Emily, his eldest at 13, lay with a schoolbook on her chest, glasses crooked against her cheek. The youngest, Daniel, snored softly, clutching a teddy bear whose seams were held together by tape and thread. Walter paused at the door, taking them in. His heart swelled with something deeper than pride, a quiet ache of gratitude. These weren't his children by blood. They had come to him from the edges of life, foster homes, shelters, hospitals. Children the world had forgotten. But each one had filled his home with laughter and purpose. They had given him reason to get up every morning, even when life kept knocking him down. He sat on the porch, the wooden steps groaning under his weight. The night air was sharp, carrying the faint smell of rain. He rubbed his hands together, rough from years of labor, construction, delivery driving, janitorial work, Uber rides, anything that would keep the house standing and bellies fed. His savings were thin, his knees were bad, and the car that once carried their survival was now a husk of metal on the side of the road. Behind him, the door creaked open. Emily stood there, hair tangled from sleep, wrapped in a faded blanket. "Dad," she whispered, rubbing her eyes. He turned, smiling faintly. "Hey, baby girl. Go back to bed. It's late." She hesitated, stepping closer. "The car broke again, didn't it?" Walter chuckled softly, the sound weary. "You always see right through me. I heard you on the phone with the mechanic last week," she said. "You said the transmission was going." He sighed and nodded. "Yeah. And now it's gone." She sat beside him, the blanket trailing over the steps. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was honest. "We'll figure something out," she said, her voice small but certain. "We always do." Walter looked at her, studying the fierce little spark in her eyes. She had been 10 when she came to him, scared and silent, her trust shattered by a world too cruel for her gentle heart. Now she sat beside him, braver than anyone he knew. He wanted to believe her words, but his chest ached with the truth. Kindness didn't pay the rent, and faith didn't fix engines. The next morning, sunlight spilled across their small living room. The children bustled quietly, sensing their father's tension even when he tried to hide it. Walter made breakfast as he always did, thin pancakes, just enough syrup for everyone. He whistled softly, pretending everything was fine. When the phone rang, it was the garage confirming what he already knew. The Toyota was beyond repair. The cost of a new engine was more than 2 months' rent. He thanked the man politely and hung up, pressing his palm to his forehead. Emily watched from the hallway, her heart twisting. She could read her father's expression like a book. He wasn't angry, Walter never was. But disappointment sat heavy on his shoulders, quiet and suffocating. After breakfast, he gathered the children in the living room. "Looks like we'll be walking for a while," he said, forcing a smile. "No Uber for a bit. But that's all right. We'll get through it." They nodded, trusting him completely. Walter went to his toolbox that evening, sorting through wrenches and sockets, pretending to tinker while his mind worked through numbers. Rent. Groceries. Utilities. Every bill loomed larger than before. The sound of small footsteps broke his thoughts. Emily and Daniel stood behind him, hands clasped. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "don't worry about the car. We're gonna help." He turned, puzzled. "You just worry about school, all right? That's your job. But you always help us," she said. "Maybe it's time we help you." He smiled faintly, thinking it was just a child's comfort. "You already do, sweetheart. You all do." That night, when the house went quiet again, Walter lay awake listening to the soft breathing of his children. His thoughts drifted to the first time he'd held Emily's hand, trembling and cold, the day he signed the adoption papers. To Daniel's laughter when he learned to ride a bike. To Maria's song-filled mornings. They weren't bound by blood, but by something stronger, the promise that he would never abandon them, no matter how hard life became. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Walter closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer, not for money, not even for luck, but for the strength to keep being the father they deserved. He didn't know that miles away, in a dusty junkyard, an old rusted car sat beneath the weight of years, holding a secret meant for him and his children. A secret that would one day turn that silence into song. For now, though, all he could hear was the soft echo of that night, the silence after the engine, the calm before the miracle. The morning after Walter's car died, the house felt different. Not broken, just quieter, heavier, like everyone was waiting for something to happen but didn't know what. The usual morning sounds, the rattle of cereal boxes, the clatter of spoons, the laughter before school, had turned into whispers. Even Daniel, the 7-year-old who usually sang while brushing his teeth, was quiet. Emily sat at the kitchen table, legs crossed beneath her, chin resting on her hand as she watched her father move slowly through the kitchen. He poured coffee, but it had gone cold before he took a sip. His shoulders seemed broader under the weight of the world. Every sigh he released felt like a silent apology to his children for something that wasn't his fault. Walter had always told them that life was like an engine, it needed care, patience, and a bit of faith to keep running. But lately, even faith seemed to sputter. Emily didn't understand the details of bills or paychecks, but she understood the look in her father's eyes. It was the same look he had the day he brought her home from the orphanage, fear that he wouldn't be enough, mixed with determination to be more than anyone expected. That afternoon, while Walter went out to look for odd jobs, Emily gathered her siblings in the living room. The sun poured through the cracked blinds, dust swirling in golden light. Daniel sat cross-legged on the rug. Maria and little James perched on the couch, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Dad's car is gone," Emily began. "He needs it to work. If he can't drive, we can't eat. So we're going to help him." Daniel frowned. "But we're just kids." Emily nodded, her voice steady. "Yeah. But Dad always says family means never letting someone fall alone. We can't buy him a new car, but maybe we can buy him something he can fix. She pulled out a glass jar from her backpack. Inside was her savings, quarters, nickels, and a few crumpled dollar bills. This was for a new backpack, she said softly. But Dad needs it more. Maria's eyes glistened. I'll give my birthday money, she said. I don't need a dress. Daniel hesitated, then ran to his room. Moments later, he returned with a handful of coins wrapped in tissue paper. It's all I've got, he said. But maybe it'll help. Emily smiled, fighting the lump in her throat. Together, they counted everything on the worn coffee table. $50.17. It didn't look like much, but to them, it was hope in its purest form. They spent the rest of the day searching through old flyers and online ads. Most cars were far beyond their reach. But then Emily found it, a rusted sedan sitting in a salvage yard on the edge of town. The ad said it didn't run, but the owner wanted it gone. Price, $50 flat. That night, after Walter had gone to bed, Emily called the number. Her voice trembled as she explained what they wanted to do. The man on the other end was silent for a long moment before saying quietly, "You got yourself a deal, sweetheart." The next morning, they pooled their money in a small envelope and walked to the address on the ad. The salvage yard stretched wide under the sun, filled with skeletal cars and the scent of oil and dust. The owner, a gruff man in overalls, watched the group of children approach. "You Booker's kids?" he asked. Emily nodded proudly. "We're his family." The man studied them for a moment, then led them to the car. It was small, dented, and sun-faded. One headlight was cracked. The hood bore a deep scar of rust. But to Emily, it looked like a treasure chest. "He'll know what to do with it," she whispered. The man smiled faintly. "Your dad must be one hell of a man." "He is," Emily said. They pushed the car the whole way home, laughing between gasps of exhaustion. The tires squeaked, the steering wheel locked, but none of that mattered. When they turned the final corner and their house came into view, Walter was already on the porch, wiping his hands with a rag after fixing a leaky faucet. He froze when he saw them. What on earth? Emily's face was flushed and shining with pride. "We got you a car, Dad." Walter stared, speechless. The rusted machine clunked to a stop in front of the house. His eyes darted from the car to his children, his voice barely above a whisper. You bought this?" $50, Daniel said proudly, holding up the empty jar. "We wanted to help." For a long moment, Walter said nothing. The porch light flickered as twilight fell, the sound of cicadas filling the air. Then he stepped forward, resting his rough, oil-stained hand on the hood. "You kids," his voice cracked. "You don't even know what this means." Emily's throat tightened. "It means we believe in you, Dad." Walter felt his knees weaken. He crouched and pulled them all into his arms, an awkward tangle of elbows and laughter and tears. For once, he didn't have to be strong. He could just be loved. Later that night, after the children went to bed, Walter stood outside under the dim glow of the porch bulb, staring at the old car. The air smelled like rain and motor oil. He traced his fingers along the rust, the chipped paint, the worn steering wheel. It wasn't just a car, it was faith made visible. Inside, Emily watched him from the window. She saw the way he looked at it, as if it were a sacred thing. In that moment, she understood something that would stay with her for life. You don't need much to create a miracle, just love that refuses to quit. When Walter finally came inside, he paused by her doorway. "You should be asleep, young lady. I just wanted to see if you liked it." He smiled, tired but proud. "It's the most beautiful car I've ever seen." Emily grinned, and for the first time in days, laughter filled their small house again. The kind of laughter that pushes the dark out of corners and replaces it with light. Outside, the broken-down car waited in the driveway, its engine silent, its body tired, but within its hollow frame, something had already begun to stir. Not in its gears or pistons, but in the hearts of the family who believed they could rebuild not just a car, but a life. That night, as Walter turned out the lights, he whispered a quiet prayer. "Thank you," he said, looking toward the old car through the window. "For them." He didn't know yet that hidden deep within that rusted frame lay something far greater than gratitude, something waiting patiently to change their lives forever. The car sat in the middle of the driveway like an old wounded animal. Its paint had faded from red to a tired brown, the metal worn thin and speckled with rust. The front bumper sagged, one tire had sunk into the dirt, and the windshield bore a spiderweb crack that caught the morning sun. Yet to Walter Booker, it looked like a miracle. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, staring at the car while his children buzzed around it with pride. Emily was polishing the hood with an old shirt, Daniel was crouched by the wheel pretending to inspect the engine, and Maria had tied a small ribbon to the antenna. They looked at him as if waiting for applause. For a long time, Walter said nothing. He simply watched them, his heart aching in that strange way love often hurts, too big to hold, too real to explain. Finally, he stepped down the porch stairs, the wood creaking beneath his boots, and placed his hand on the hood. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Emily smiled, her voice trembling with excitement. "You think you can fix it?" Walter chuckled, though the sound was more fragile than before. "Oh, I'll fix it. Not because it's worth fixing, but because you're worth it." That night, long after the children had gone to bed, Walter stayed outside under the weak glow of the porch light. He lifted the hood and stared into the maze of metal, wires, and dust. Every part of it spoke a language of decay: hoses cracked, engine seized, battery gone. Most men would have given up after one look. But Walter had never been most men. He rolled up his sleeves and began to work. The sound of a wrench echoed across the empty street as moths circled the light. Sweat trickled down his temple. His hands moved with the slow precision of a man who understood that repairing something broken was not about speed, it was about faith. From the window, Emily watched him. She saw the way he leaned into the engine, his movements deliberate, like someone tending to an old friend. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered, "You can do it, Dad." Over the next week, the driveway became their gathering place. After school, the children would rush to help him. Daniel brought him rags. Maria held the flashlight. Emily handed him tools from the box she'd labeled with tape and marker, Dad's Hope Kit. Walter's laughter began to return in small bursts. Sometimes, when he'd loosen a stubborn bolt or get the headlights to flicker for half a second, he'd look up and grin. "You see that?" he'd say. "She's got a little life left in her yet." And every time, the kids would cheer as if he'd just saved the world. The neighbors, however, saw something else. From across the street, two men sat on their porch steps, coffee cups in hand. "Look at that fool," one muttered. "Can't even feed all them kids, and he's out there fixing junk." The other snorted. "Man's wasting his time. Love don't pay the mortgage." Walter heard them. The words slipped through the air, sharp as nails. But he didn't look up. Instead, he tightened another bolt, the muscles in his jaw hardening. He wasn't fixing a car. He was rebuilding a promise, that no matter how hard the world tried to break him, he'd keep standing for his children. When Friday came, Walter surprised them all. He picked up the youngest three from school in a borrowed pickup and took them to the hardware store. There, he spent the last of his handyman wages on a battery, spark plugs, and a can of paint. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give the car a second chance. That evening, they worked together as the sun bled into the horizon. Emily painted the doors with steady hands while Daniel used a toothbrush to clean the wheel rims. Maria hummed softly, her voice carrying warmth into the cooling air. Walter stepped back, wiping his brow. The car still looked rough, but something in it had changed. It was beginning to look alive again. He thought of how each child had arrived in his life. Emily, the quiet one, had come first, an orphan of the foster system, too serious for her age. Maria had followed, a 5-year-old from a broken home, afraid of loud voices. Daniel, the baby of the group, had been found through a church shelter. None of them had shared his blood, yet they shared something deeper, his belief that love could heal what the world discarded. As night fell, Emily climbed onto the hood, her feet swinging above the bumper. "Dad," she said, looking up at the stars, "you think it'll ever run again?" Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe. Maybe not. But you know what? Even if it doesn't, that's okay." "Why?" she asked. "Because it's already done what it was meant to do." She tilted her head. "What's that?" He looked at her, his little girl, his light, and said, "It reminded me what I'm fighting for." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full, of gratitude, of quiet strength, of the kind of peace that comes only from knowing you're not alone anymore. Later that night, when the house had gone dark, Walter sat beside the car with a cup of lukewarm coffee. He ran his fingers across the hood, feeling the small dents like scars on a veteran's skin. In the reflection of the porch light, he saw his own face, tired, lined, but alive. He remembered his own father, a man who never stayed. Remembered the nights of hunger, the winters with no heat, the feeling of being unwanted. And he thought of how far he had come, to be here, surrounded by laughter, by trust, by children who looked at him the way he had once wished someone would. A gust. Wind brushed past, scattering dry leaves across the driveway. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, a low, mournful sound that somehow felt like hope. Walter smiled. "We'll get there," he whispered to the car, as if speaking to a friend. "You and me." Inside, the children slept soundly. Emily dreamed of the day her father would start that engine again. Daniel dreamed of a trip to the park in their new car. Maria dreamed of music, laughter, and light. And Walter? He dreamed not of gold or fortune, but of endurance. Of the small, stubborn beauty of a love that refuses to rust. Under the soft hum of the porch light, the car gleamed faintly, a wounded relic reborn as a symbol of family. It would still take weeks before the miracle under its seat would reveal itself. But for now, it was enough. The driveway smelled of oil and paint, the air heavy with the warmth of something money could never buy. Hope. The nights on Sycamore Street had always been quiet, but lately, they carried a new rhythm, the faint metallic clink of tools, the low hum of effort, and the soft laughter of children trying to help their father rebuild a dream. Under the weak glow of the porch bulb, Walter Booker knelt beside the old car that had once seemed too broken to save. His hands, thick and calloused from years of hard labor, worked with a gentle precision. Every twist of the wrench, every scrape of metal, was an act of devotion, not just to the car, but to the small army of children who now watched him like he was performing a miracle. It was late, past 9, and the air smelled of oil and summer dust. Crickets sang from the grass, their chorus blending with the faint clatter of sockets rolling across the driveway. Emily sat cross-legged nearby, holding a flashlight that flickered every so often. Daniel was half asleep on the porch steps, his head resting on Maria's shoulder. Yet none of them wanted to go inside. The driveway had become their sanctuary, the place where love worked harder than luck ever could. Walter's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "Hand me the half-inch socket, baby." Emily rummaged through the toolbox and passed it to him. "This one?" "That's the one," he said, smiling faintly. "See? You're getting good at this." She grinned, proud. "Maybe I'll be a mechanic when I grow up." He chuckled. "You'll be whatever you want to be. Just remember to build things that last, cars, dreams, or people." The words sank deep, more than he knew. Emily looked at her father, the way the porch light caught the silver threads in his hair, the way his shoulders hunched from years of carrying too much. She thought he looked like someone carved from resilience. Walter worked until sweat glistened on his brow and the muscles in his arms ached. He'd managed to clean out the carburetor, replace the battery, and reconnect what wiring he could salvage. It wasn't much, but it was progress, and progress was hope. Every night followed the same pattern. Dinner. Dishes. Then the driveway. Sometimes the younger kids brought him lemonade. Other times, they fell asleep under blankets laid out beside the car while he kept tinkering. The faint glow of his work lamp spilled over them like a guardian light. The neighbors still watched from their porches, shaking their heads. "There he goes again," one man murmured. "Can't let go of junk." But Walter had stopped hearing them. The world had always doubted him, a single black man raising a house full of adopted children of every color. People had called it reckless, naive, even foolish. But Walter had never believed in the world's logic. He believed in what he could hold, the laughter of his children, the warmth of their hugs, the way they called him dad like it was the safest word they knew. One evening, as the sky bruised purple with dusk, Emily came out holding an old notebook. "Dad," she said, "can I show you something?" He looked up from the engine, wiping his hands on a rag. "What you got there?" "I've been drawing." She flipped the pages toward him, pencil sketches of the car, of him bent over the hood, of the family gathered around. One drawing showed him smiling, his hands open as light spilled from the car's engine like a sunrise. Walter's breath caught. "You made this?" She nodded shyly. "It's how I see us." He blinked hard, the edges of his eyes damp. "You're gonna make me cry in front of my own toolbox, girl." She giggled, and he gently took the sketch from her, folding it carefully and slipping it into his shirt pocket. "I'll keep it right here," he said, tapping his chest. "Closest place to the heart." That night, they worked longer than usual. The porch light buzzed, moths circling it in tired orbits. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, and music played faintly from a distant house. But for the Bookers, the world had shrunk to the circle of that light and the promise hidden inside it. At midnight, Walter finally leaned back, exhaling. "All right, troops," he said. "We've done what we can tonight. Let's get some rest." But Emily shook her head. "Can we stay out here a little longer? It's nice." He smiled. "Yeah. It is. So they sat together in silence, the car between them, battered, patient, almost alive. Emily leaned her head on his arm, and Daniel, half asleep, mumbled, "Dad, when the car runs again, can we go to the park? The one with the swings?" Walter swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "Yeah, buddy," he whispered. "We'll all go together." The promise hung in the air, fragile but sincere. As the children drifted off, Walter stared at the horizon, where the faintest silver line of dawn touched the sky. He thought of every hardship, the nights he'd gone hungry so they wouldn't, the rejections he'd faced when trying to adopt, the judgmental stares from strangers in grocery stores. He had built his life out of other people's no's, stacking them like bricks until they formed a home. Now, as the wind whispered through the trees, he realized something profound. This car wasn't just about transportation. It was about transformation. It had brought his children together, given them a sense of purpose, reminded them all that love was never useless, even when it came wrapped in rust. When the first light of morning broke, Walter stood and stretched, his body sore but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He turned one last time to the car and murmured, "We'll make you new again. I promise." Inside, the children slept soundly, smiles soft on their faces. Emily dreamed of engines roaring to life and open roads stretching forever. Daniel dreamed of swing sets and laughter. Maria dreamed of sunshine, her small hands gripping the wheel beside her father's. And Walter, once a man defined by struggle, dreamed not of survival, but of legacy. That night marked a turning point. He didn't know it yet, but soon his fingers would brush against something hidden deep beneath the seat, something heavy, gleaming, and impossible. But before fate revealed its gold, these nights in the driveway gave him something pure, the quiet, unshakable truth that even in poverty, love can build palaces. The car stood still in the soft dawn light, its chipped paint catching the first hint of gold from the rising sun, a foreshadowing of the miracle that slept within. And as Walter stepped inside the house, the porch light finally flickered out, as if to say, "You've done enough for tonight." The air was cool that evening, the kind of chill that slipped quietly into the bones after a long day of work. The last of summer's warmth was fading, and the smell of damp leaves hung heavy in the air. Walter Booker stood in his driveway, leaning over the hood of the old car with a flashlight clamped between his teeth. His children were inside, their laughter faint through the window. But out here, it was just him, the whisper of crickets, and the stubborn rattle of a bolt that refused to loosen. He grunted softly, twisting the wrench until it finally gave. "There you go," he murmured. The satisfaction of that sound was small but real. For weeks, he'd been chipping away at the car's decay, a bolt here, a spark plug there. It still didn't run, but it looked alive again. The dents had been buffed smooth, the hood reattached, the doors aligned. To Walter, it was no longer a junkyard ghost. It was a promise kept. He wiped his hands on his jeans and crouched to look under the seat. A small nut had rolled away earlier, and he could hear it clinking somewhere in the shadows. He reached under, feeling around for it. Instead of the familiar chill of metal, his fingertips brushed something coarse, rough fabric, tightly wrapped around something solid. Walter frowned. What in the world? He reached deeper, his knuckles scraping against the seat rails until his hand closed around the object. It was heavy, far too heavy to be a loose tool or a piece of scrap. The fabric felt oily, like something meant to be hidden, preserved. He pulled it free with a low grunt. The object hit the driveway with a dull thud. Walter sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The wrapped shape was no larger than a loaf of bread but dense, unnaturally so. For a long moment, he just stared at it, the work light humming quietly above him. His pulse quickened. The night, once familiar and still, suddenly felt watchful. "Emily," he called softly. A light flicked on inside. A moment later, the screen door creaked open, and Emily stepped onto the porch, rubbing her eyes. "Dad? What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. His voice came out low, uncertain. "Come here, sweetheart. I want you to see something." She hurried down the steps, blankets still draped around her shoulders. Walter crouched beside the wrapped bundle, his face tense, lit only by the flickering bulb above. Emily knelt next to him. "What is it?" "I don't know," he said. "Found it under the driver's seat." He hesitated before unwrapping it. The oily cloth peeled back in layers, each revealing a little more of the strange weight inside. The smell of metal and old grease filled the air. Then, as the last fold fell away, a glint of something bright caught the light. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. It wasn't scrap. It wasn't junk. It was gold, solid, heavy, unmistakable gold. Walter's breath caught in his throat. He turned it in his hands, the bar thick and gleaming even under grime. His reflection shimmered faintly across its surface. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. Emily's eyes widened. "Is it real?" He didn't answer. His mind raced, disbelief, fear, awe, all crashing together. He'd seen gold before, small bits of jewelry, maybe a watch. But this was pure. A fortune sitting in his hands, found in a car bought for $50 of faith. The porch light buzzed again, and the glow from the window cast soft shadows over their faces. Emily touched the edge of the bar, her fingers trembling. "Dad, does this mean we're rich?" Walter looked at her, his heart heavy with something he couldn't yet name. "I don't know what it means," he said quietly. "But I know it means we gotta be careful." He stood slowly, his gaze sweeping over the yard as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. The neighborhood was still, but the silence felt different now, not peaceful, but alert. He could almost hear his pulse in his ears. "Let's get this inside," he said finally. They walked together toward the porch. The gold bar, wrapped once more in the oily cloth, seemed to hum with invisible weight. Inside, the other children had gathered, drawn by curiosity. Daniel blinked sleepily. "What's that, Dad?" Walter laid the bundle gently on the kitchen table. The single overhead light swung slightly, casting long shadows across the walls. "Something we found in the car," he said. "But I don't want any of you talking about it outside this house, you hear?" They nodded, wide-eyed. He unwrapped the cloth again, slower this time. The light hit the gold, filling the small kitchen with a glow so warm it almost looked unreal. The children gasped. Maria covered her mouth. Daniel whispered, "It's like treasure." Walter stared at the bar, his reflection staring back, tired eyes, calloused hands, and a question that suddenly seemed too big to answer. For years, life had been a test of endurance. Every meal stretched, every bill juggled, every dream deferred. Now, sitting on his kitchen table, was enough to change all of that. But change, Walter knew, was dangerous. Money could build, but it could also destroy. He sat in silence for a long while as his children watched him. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, fear, hope, disbelief. Finally, he spoke. "Listen," he said, his voice steady but low. "This doesn't belong to us. Not yet. Maybe not at all. But it's here for a reason. So we're going to do what's right, not what's easy. Emily frowned. What's the difference? Walter smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed fixed on the gold. Easy would be selling it and pretending the world owes us something. Right is figuring out why it came to us, and making sure it helps, not hurts. He looked up at them then, really looked, at the faces that had once known only fear and now glowed with fragile belief. And he realized that this moment, right here, was worth more than any gold bar. Go on now, he said softly. It's late. We'll talk more in the morning. The children drifted off reluctantly, glancing back at the table as if afraid it might vanish. Emily lingered the longest. Before heading to bed, she whispered, "Dad, maybe it's a gift." Walter's gaze softened. Maybe, baby girl. But sometimes, the hardest part of a gift is knowing how to use it. When the house fell quiet again, he sat alone at the table. The gold glowed faintly under the light, its reflection stretching across the wood like a sunrise. He reached out and rested his palm on it, feeling its coolness, its weight, its silent question. Was it fortune? Or was it a test? Outside, wind moved through the trees, whispering against the windows. The car sat dark in the driveway, silent as ever, holding its secrets. But for the first time in years, Walter felt something shift inside him, not greed, not relief, but a spark of destiny. Whatever this was, he thought, it didn't find them by accident. And as he turned off the light and stood there in the dark, the faint reflection of gold lingered like a candle flame in his heart, fragile, bright, and impossible to ignore. Morning light poured softly through the kitchen window, brushing across the old table where the gold bar still rested. Its surface caught the sun in a quiet shimmer, casting golden streaks across the faded wood. The children had already gone off to school, their chatter lingering faintly in the walls, but Walter Booker remained seated, hands folded before him, staring at the thing that had changed everything, and nothing, all at once. He had barely slept. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of wind outside had made him think of it, that bar gleaming like a secret he had no right to keep. He'd wrapped it again in its greasy cloth, then unwrapped it, then wrapped it once more, as if the action itself could tell him what to do. He knew gold was wealth. He also knew wealth had destroyed men far stronger than he was. Walter wasn't afraid of hard work or hunger, those he'd known all his life. What scared him now was temptation, the thought that something so heavy, so dazzling, could twist what was pure inside a man if he wasn't careful. He reached out and touched it, his rough fingers leaving faint smudges on its polished face. It was cool, solid, immovable, a piece of something ancient, something beyond his understanding. He'd spent years fighting to keep his family together with nothing but sweat and faith, and now fate had placed this in his hands. Why him? Why now? When Emily returned from school that afternoon, she found her father in the same seat, elbows on the table, the wrapped gold before him like an unanswered prayer. "You haven't moved all day," she said, dropping her backpack by the chair. He looked up and smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About blessings," he murmured. "And the price they sometimes come with." Emily frowned, sliding into the chair across from him. "You think it's bad luck?" Walter shook his head. "No. But I think anything that comes easy can test you harder than what you work for. It's not about luck, sweetheart. It's about what kind of man I choose to be with it." He stood, finally breaking the spell of stillness, and took the bar into his hands. "Come on," he said. "We're going for a walk." Emily followed him through the streets of their modest neighborhood. The autumn wind tugged gently at her braids, carrying the smell of chimney smoke and drying leaves. They walked past the park where Daniel liked to swing, past the corner store that let them buy on credit when times were rough. Walter held the bundle close to his chest, every step heavy with decision. They stopped in front of a small brick building with faded letters across the window, Harrison and Sons Appraisal. The bell above the door jingled softly as they stepped inside. Behind the counter sat a gray-haired man in glasses, his sleeves rolled up, polishing a silver pocket watch. Walter set the wrapped cloth on the counter. "Sir," he said carefully, "I found something. I'd like to know what it's worth, and if it's real." The man nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He unfolded the cloth, and when the light hit the bar, his expression shifted from interest to astonishment. He turned it gently in his hands, tapping it once with a small tool. The sound rang clear and heavy. "Well," the man said after a long pause, "I don't know where you came across this, Mr. Booker, but it's genuine. Pure. You're holding about $500,000 in gold, maybe more." Emily gasped softly. Walter didn't move. He simply nodded, his heart pounding like distant thunder. The appraiser studied him for a moment. "You plan on selling?" "Not yet," Walter said. "I just needed to know it was real." The man smiled faintly. "Oh, it's real, all right. Real enough to change a life, or ruin one." Walter thanked him, rewrapped the gold, and stepped back out into the crisp afternoon light. Emily walked beside him, quiet for a long while before she finally asked, "So, what are you gonna do with it?" He exhaled slowly. "First thing I'm gonna do is think. Second thing, I'm gonna pray." That night, when the kids gathered for dinner, Walter didn't mention the appraiser. The table was filled with simple food, beans, rice, and cornbread, but the air felt different. The children laughed freely, unaware of the weight their father carried just a few feet away, locked in a drawer by the kitchen wall. After dinner, as the younger ones dozed off, Emily lingered. "Dad," she said softly, "what if it was meant for us? Like, a reward for everything you've done?" Walter smiled, setting a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it is. But a reward isn't what makes a man rich. It's what he does after he's rewarded that tells you who he really is." He turned off the lights and walked out onto the porch, staring up at the sky. The stars blinked faintly through a veil of clouds. He thought of his past, of nights spent hungry, of the pain of watching people he loved leave. He thought of the children asleep inside, their dreams safe under his roof. He knew, deep down, that whatever came next had to be handled with care. Over the next few weeks, Walter took quiet steps. He sold a small portion of the gold anonymously, enough to pay off the lingering debts that haunted their mailbox. The power stayed on without warning notices. The fridge stayed full. The roof stopped leaking. He fixed the creaky porch and bought each child a pair of shoes that actually fit. But he didn't flaunt it. There were no new cars, no designer clothes, no whispers of sudden fortune. He still worked handyman jobs and took small rideshare gigs in his spare time. When neighbors asked how things were improving, he simply smiled and said, "God's been kind." What no one saw was the quiet ritual Walter performed every night, sitting at the table, looking at the remaining gold, and whispering a single prayer, "Let this never take what love has built." Emily began to notice changes too, not just in their home, but in her father. The tension in his shoulders had softened. The furrows in his brow had eased. He smiled more easily now, laughed more often. But he never once forgot the lesson the car had already taught him. True wealth was not measured by what you had, but by what you gave. On a Saturday afternoon, Walter gathered the children around the table. "Each of you," he said, "is going to have a savings account. Just a little something for your future." Their faces lit up with awe. "Really?" Daniel squealed. "Like real money?" Walter laughed, ruffling his hair. "Like real money. But here's the deal, you have to promise me something. You'll use it to build something good. Something honest. Something that helps others, the way we've been helped." They all nodded solemnly, their small faces glowing with pride. Later that night, as the house quieted and the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, Walter stepped outside once more. The car still sat in the driveway, rusted, unmoving, but radiant in the moonlight. He placed a hand on the hood and whispered, "Thank you." Because it wasn't just metal anymore. It was memory, miracle, and message all at once, proof that even the broken things in life can carry hidden blessings. And though the gold had lifted their burdens, it was love that kept their hearts light. Autumn had given way to the kind of winter that painted every roof silver and made the breath of morning look like ghosts. On Sycamore Street, most houses stood dull and gray beneath the frost, except one. Walter Booker's house. The porch light, once flickering, now glowed steady and warm. The front steps had been repaired, the loose boards replaced. The once leaking roof no longer groaned when it rained. It wasn't a mansion, far from it, but it was theirs. Every nail, every brushstroke, every repaired crack in the wall spoke of something deeper than money. It spoke of hope rebuilt by love and quiet perseverance. Inside, the walls carried laughter again. Not the nervous kind that fills silence, but the deep, unguarded laughter that belongs to people who feel safe. The old hand-me-down furniture had been polished, the curtains replaced, the kitchen painted soft yellow by Emily and Maria over a weekend of giggles and spilled paint. The house looked the same from the outside, but it felt different. Alive. Walter stood in the doorway, watching his children decorate a small Christmas tree they'd found at a thrift shop. He smiled as Daniel tried to hang ornaments too high and nearly toppled over, catching himself on Maria's arm. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging a paper garland she'd made herself. "Not too close to the heater, baby girl," Walter said gently. "We don't need a bonfire tonight." Emily grinned. "Yes, sir." He leaned against the doorframe, heart full. He'd kept the secret of the gold quiet, telling no one outside their home. He'd used just enough to build stability, the rest was tucked away, safe for a future that once seemed impossible. But what mattered most wasn't the repairs or the savings accounts or the small upgrades in their lives. It was the peace. For the first time in years, peace filled every room. Walter still worked, handyman jobs, deliveries, and rides for neighbors who needed a lift. He refused to let the gold change who he was. It wasn't wealth that defined him, it was work, faith, and the children who called him Dad like it was a badge of honor. When the mail arrived that morning, Emily fetched it and set a white envelope on the table. Walter glanced at it, brow furrowing. It was from the bank, the one where he'd quietly opened the children's savings accounts. He unfolded the letter, eyes scanning the page, then smiled. "Good news?" Emily asked. "The best kind," Walter said softly. "Your futures are starting to grow." She tilted her head. "You mean our savings?" He nodded. "A little interest here, a little patience there, it'll turn into something beautiful one day." Emily thought for a moment, then smiled. "Like the car?" Walter laughed. Exactly like the car. That evening, a soft snow began to fall, not enough to blanket the ground, just enough to shimmer under the streetlights. Walter went outside to fix a loose gutter, his breath clouding the cold air. The neighborhood was quiet. Across the street, Mr. Klein, the same neighbor who had once mocked him, was now watching from his porch. He raised a hand in greeting. Walter hesitated, then smiled and waved back. A few minutes later, Klein crossed the street, crunching over the frosted grass. "Booker," he said, rubbing his hands together. "House looks good. You've done well for yourself." "Thank you," Walter replied simply. "I misjudged you," Klein said after a pause. "Figured you were just another man chasing luck. But, you built something here. Respect." Walter nodded, humbled but quiet. "Wasn't luck," he said. "Just love, and a little bit of stubbornness." The man chuckled. "Well, whatever it was, it worked." He gave a small salute and shuffled back home. Walter stood there for a moment, watching the snow drift softly across the street, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. The world still wasn't easy, bills came, work slowed in the winter, and he still had to stretch every dollar carefully. But for once, he wasn't chasing survival. He was living. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Walter walked into the driveway and stood before the car, the same rusted frame that had started it all. The snow gathered lightly on its hood, sparkling in the glow of the porch light. He brushed a hand across it, revealing the faded paint beneath. The engine hadn't roared to life yet, though he'd replaced almost everything inside. But somehow, he didn't mind. The car had already given them more than transportation, it had given them transformation. He crouched beside it and whispered, "You did good, old friend." Inside, Emily stirred awake and peeked through the window. She saw her father out there, kneeling beside the car, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. He looked peaceful, almost proud. She didn't know what he whispered, but she could feel what it meant. Gratitude. By spring, the house had become something of a local curiosity. Neighbors who once gossiped now greeted the Bookers with nods and smiles. Children from nearby blocks came to play in their yard. Walter had fixed up the old swing set and painted the fence bright white. It wasn't about showing off, it was about giving back. One Sunday, the pastor at their small church asked Walter to share his story. He didn't mention gold or miracles. He spoke only of perseverance, family, and the power of faith when everything else runs dry. "You don't need fortune to find purpose," he said from the pulpit. "You just need love strong enough to carry you through the storm." The congregation rose to its feet. Emily cried quietly in the front row. After the service, people lined up to shake his hand. Some offered thanks, others asked for advice. Walter smiled through it all, humbled and almost embarrassed by the attention. He never saw himself as a hero, just a man who refused to quit. That night, when they came home, Emily placed something new on the living room wall, a framed picture she'd drawn months earlier. It showed their old car surrounded by light, with words written beneath in careful handwriting. "The house that hope built." Walter looked at it for a long time. His throat tightened, and he pulled her into his arms. "You got it just right," he whispered. From then on, every guest who entered their home stopped to look at that drawing. Some smiled, some asked for the story, but Walter always gave the same answer. It's about a broken car that reminded a family they were never broken to begin with. The house stood tall that spring, not grand, not lavish, but filled with warmth that reached beyond its walls. And as the sun dipped behind the hills of Sycamore Street, its golden rays caught on the car's old metal surface, glowing faintly, like a secret that would forever belong to the Bookers. Because in the end, gold hadn't built their house. Love had. Smiled through it all, humbled and almost embarrassed by the attention. He never saw himself as a hero, just a man who refused to quit. That night, when they came home, Emily placed something new on the living room wall. The spring air on Sycamore Street smelled of lilacs and rain-soaked earth. Morning light shimmered through wet branches, glancing off the old car in the Booker driveway, the same car that had once been nothing but rust and regret. Now, it sat quietly, its hood streaked with sunlight, its dents softened by time. It wasn't restored or polished. It didn't gleam with new paint. But it stood there proudly, like a monument, to love, to struggle, to a family that refused to break. Walter Booker stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched the younger children play tag in the front yard, their laughter spilling into the cool air. Emily, taller now, sat on the steps beside him, her sketchbook open on her lap. She was 16 and thoughtful, the kind of girl who spoke less but saw more. She was sketching the car again, but this time, it looked different on paper, not a wreck, not a project, but something sacred. Above it, she'd drawn faint rays of light breaking through clouds. "You still drawing that old thing?" Walter asked, his voice carrying both pride and teasing. Emily smiled. "It's not an old thing," she said softly. "It's where everything changed." He nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "You're right. I guess it is." In the months since the gold's discovery, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost holy. The bills stayed paid. The fridge stayed full. The children's shoes no longer wore through at the toes. But beyond the small comforts, something deeper had changed, a quiet confidence had replaced the years of fear. Walter had become something of a local legend, though few knew why. Neighbors who once whispered pity now stopped to ask for his help fixing fences, unclogging drains, or simply to talk. He never turned anyone. He carried himself differently now, not proud, but peaceful. The car, untouched except for the repairs he'd already made, remained in its place like a relic of the miracle. He refused to sell it. Refused to move it. When people asked why, he'd only smile and say, "That car gave us our faith back. Some things you don't trade for money." That afternoon, Emily joined him in the backyard while he fixed the gate. She leaned against the fence, arms folded. "Dad," she said carefully, "what are you going to do with the rest of it?" "The gold, I mean." Walter paused, hammer midair. "Why?" "I just wondered." "You never talk about it anymore." He set the hammer down, his eyes thoughtful. "That's because some blessings speak loudest when they're quiet. I've used what we needed. The rest, that's for tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" He smiled. "The kind I'll never see, but you will." That night, when the house was asleep, Walter sat at the kitchen table with the gold bar wrapped in its cloth once again. He hadn't touched it in months, but he felt its weight like an old friend. It no longer frightened him. It humbled him. He took out a small envelope and began to write, neat, deliberate handwriting that carried the care of a man who knew exactly what mattered. "To my children. If you're reading this, it means I've gone home to the Lord. Don't be sad. Remember what I always told you, love is the only thing you can't lose, no matter what happens. This gold never belonged to me. It belonged to us. But more than that, it belonged to the faith that carried us through the dark. Use it wisely. Build something good. And never forget, the richest thing you'll ever own is each other. Dad. He sealed the letter and placed it in a tin box with the gold bar. Then he set it under the loose floorboard beneath the table, the same spot where, years ago, he'd once hidden overdue bills and eviction notices. The irony made him smile. Time moved on quietly. Seasons changed, the children grew taller, and the house grew older, its walls filled with the kind of stories that never fade. Walter aged too, his hair turning silver, his walk slower but his spirit still strong. On his 70th birthday, the yard filled with laughter, balloons, and the smell of barbecue. Neighbors came, old friends visited, and children, now grown, returned with their own families. Emily, now in her 30s and an art teacher, unveiled a gift she had been working on for years. It was a painting, large, luminous, and breathtakingly real. It showed the old car bathed in morning light, surrounded by children's shadows that stretched like angels. The background glowed faintly with a golden hue, as if heaven itself had touched it. Walter's eyes misted as he looked at it. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "It's our story," Emily replied. "I call it the Monument of Rust." That night, as the party faded and candles burned low, Walter stepped outside one last time. The air was cool, the sky full of stars. He walked to the driveway and placed his hand on the hood of the car. The metal was cold but familiar. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you. For the pain. For the struggle. For the miracle hidden beneath a seat." The car stood silent, moonlight brushing its edges, the sound of crickets rising like a hymn. In its stillness, it seemed to breathe, to carry every memory of laughter, of nights spent working, of prayers whispered into the dark. Weeks later, when Walter passed peacefully in his sleep, the children gathered around the table in grief and love. Emily found the letter and the tin box beneath the floorboard. When she opened it, the gold gleamed faintly, but it was the words that broke them, words written by a man who had found heaven long before he left the earth. Years passed, and Sycamore Street changed. New families moved in, houses were rebuilt, but one thing never changed, the Booker home. The car still sat in the driveway, untouched, its rusted frame now surrounded by wildflowers that Emily planted each spring. Visitors often stopped and asked why she kept it there. She always smiled gently and said, "Because it reminds me that miracles don't have to shine, they just have to endure." And so it stood, quiet, weathered, and eternal. A monument not of metal, but of meaning. When the sun dipped each evening, its last light would strike the car's hood, sending one soft shimmer of gold across the yard, as if reminding everyone who passed that love, once planted, never truly fades. It was no longer a broken car. It was the heart of a story, the legacy of a man who found wealth not in what he discovered, but in what he gave. The Monument of Rust. A family's proof that even the forgotten things in life can hold the brightest treasures.